Hey everyone, my name is Lynx Kameli, and in this week's video I wanted to jump on the bandwagon of why I quit WoW videos, but give my unique perspective as a hardcore raider and someone who doesn't enjoy the typical FF14 hooks like the story. Perhaps you're a Mythic raider yourself and wondering if you'd enjoy raiding in FF14, or perhaps you're purely an FF14 player who wants to know how a hardcore raider finds enjoyment in the game. Either way, I often feel like these videos focus on the casual side of 14 and not so much
couple minutes of this earlier, and I remember immediately started getting into some crazy things that just started stirring my imagination where I'm like, oh, I gotta talk about this. So.
The high-end raiding side. So here's why I quit Mythic raiding in WoW to raid in FF14. I'm a player whose enjoyment of FF14 comes almost solely from raiding, and have notoriously skipped all of the story content in 14, speedrunning to endgame, and reaching raiding as quickly as possible.
I've heard a few people having that experience and just completely missing the boat. Yeah, I'm very similar to this guy, where I'm more of a solo player. It's not that I'm against people, definitely don't dislike people, but definitely more drifting towards the solo play style. So anything that appeals to that while kind of like lightly pushing you towards multiplayer is the game for me.
Possible. This is a pretty uncommon gameplay style in FF14, with the main draws of the game being the story, the characters, the world, glamours, crafting, housing, and other forms of more casual content. This isn't to say I don't enjoy these parts of the game, and I don't look at skipping the story
all those
and rushing to
endgame areas
as
where you
some
can
sort
get
of badge
lost
of
in.
honor, but what I care about the most is endgame and high-end raiding.
There used to be so much more of that in WoW. That was a big part of WoW, was just hanging with your guildies.
Is that despite the game not catering to high-end raiders, there is still tons of enjoyment to be found and difficult challenges to overcome in Final Fantasy XIV raiding. An important part of FF14 raiding that is often not very well discussed is the issue of boss count in raiding. What I mean by this is that every Savage raid tier in Final Fantasy XIV has only 4 bosses, and this sounds like an incredibly low amount compared to WoW's 10 to 12 bosses.
I do remember this being such a huge concern of mine when I first started picking it up, was how the endgame was.
Per raid tier.
I heard they were really consistent with content, but I didn't know if it
raids are released
felt
as
skim
one
as a result.
piece of content, containing all of the bosses for a tier in one area. When a new raid in WoW is released,
really healthy,
that
like
is
people
the
are
raid, and aside
immensely
from Mythic Plus, it's the only place
tier
you'll be
after
facing
tier.
new encounters. FF14 raids are broken up between 24-man raids, also known as Alliance raids, 8-man Extreme Trials, Savage raids, and Ultimates. There are 4 bosses per Alliance raid, 2 Extreme Trials per raid tier,
going from
4
5 and
Savage
10 to 4 and 8 is
and
still a bit of adjustment for me.
It, 1 or 4
I kind of feel like they could do it with an extra DPS.
Total of 11
like it would help
bosses
Q's a bit more.
Cycle. The reason
it would change the feel.
Be 1 or 4, depending on how
I do feel like it feels a bit more
comfy.
comfy.
Raids are boss gauntlets that contain multiple bosses split up by phases inside of one fight, which is why ultimate fights are generally upwards of 15 to 18 minutes for one encounter. With the raids being split up like this, you have a trade-off of having more diversity and variety in bosses, where they exist in the game, their design,
around
and their
15,
arenas,
maybe even 20 minutes, that's how a lot of WoW fights are,
and a smaller pool of bosses
that's usually a release.
The last part
you give it like a month, maybe 2 months, people start out-gearing and just crushing it.
Game, yes, you will only have the 4
then
Savage
it's not even like
to tackle,
the intended
as
experience
only
anymore.
As an extreme challenge, not rewarding better gear, but a transmog weapon and a title to show off your accomplishment.
I've been doing so much of the early expansions so far. I'm in the very end part of Heaven's Ward at the moment. So I've still only been experiencing the beginning, but it just feels like the raids are so healthy. Like they don't cut them loose or anything like that.
Diversity of raiding, though, means that outside of your weekly Savage raiding, you have many other pieces of content that you can take part in and still receive rewards that fuel your Savage and Ultimate raids. Alliance raids, in comparison to WoW, are around LFR to early normal mode difficulty, but reward coins which can be turned in for gear upgrade tokens, which are required to upgrade your gear to the highest level. These tokens also drop in Savage,
I've been experiencing. I was hoping those would continue through.
But they're a good way to
sounds like they carry it through the entire game.
Or if you're getting
like as soon as they
receiving the upgrade token.
Again, I'm like, wow. It seems like once they like find a system that works, they're like, oh, this is a great idea. We should just continue doing that. It makes sense.
Tokens fast enough to keep up with your gear upgrades. Moving on
I
to extreme
appreciate
trials,
like
the next tier above Alliance raids, they are around early heroic boss difficulty,
changed
meaning
up,
that they are
but
very often pugged
it's not
and
being
don't
changed
require
up for the
voice
better, then
comms
why
or
bother?
much commitment to farm them. These
Or why
bosses
even,
drop
like,
high item level
discontinue?
weapons, allowing you an avenue to acquire a near savage raid level weapon much more easily than savage raiding. Many high-end raiders actively progress these trials while also progressing the savage raid tier, as the weapons from extreme trials can prove highly beneficial when progressing in savage.
Ooh.
They also drop mounts, so people farm these extreme trials throughout the entire expansion. This is a huge part of FF14 that I love, the fact that a new raid release does not invalidate the previous raids. Because there are cosmetics tied to the raids, like mounts and transmog items, people actively farm old content forever,
in addition to the ultimate weapons.
Experience an older extreme trial
It's
with
like
7
a couple
others
key
just for fun,
weapon
or to
types
get
that
the
I'm going to be going
mount
after.
Or transmog, whatever reason you have for being there, you can find a group for it. Compare that to World of Warcraft, where a new raid release means all 10 or so bosses that you've been farming are now seemingly gone forever.
Yeah, unless
really
it's time walking, in which case it's like
to keep doing throughout an expansion just out of enjoyment.
a bastardized version of the experience.
Better gear exists,
for a very limited FOMO amount of time.
Add on to that the fact that you can have every class in the game on one character in Final Fantasy XIV.
I just want to be able to do it.
Classes and roles whenever
it's like,
you
hey,
want.
I liked doing that thing before. I want to do it again. And just let me do it.
Maybe I want to tank an extreme trial today. Or maybe I want to heal it. Maybe I've been trying to learn melee DPS
or that, you know, like
to get good enough for Savage. This
being
is one
able
of the
to
biggest
experience it as one role, another role.
Moving on to Savage.
There's a lot of them I've been hopping in as DPS, and like if I just don't feel like reading up that much on the fight yet, then it's like, okay, I'll like pick the basics and like experiences to DPS. But even if I like don't get all the strats down, then like we're probably gonna wipe once or twice anyway. And then like you see the 1 or 2 mechanics and you got it. But it's so amazing that you could like experience it time and time again as like these different roles, like, oh, this different flavor of tank, or like a different style of healing, you know, because like each one has its own flow as you're like experiencing the combat from a different point of view. Like Final Fantasy XIV, it reminds me of what WoW used to do really, really well back in the older days, where they would talk about this stuff at BlizzCon. Like they would be thinking about what a raid would be like in an encounter, and they would be thinking, what's this boss going to be like as a druid? If I'm coming up on these ads in this hallway, how's that going to feel as a hunter? You know, like each class, like they did like a user story, like a step through, you know, for each one of those multiple times to make sure everyone kind of had like at least 1 or 2 things through the entire raid experience where they feel like they contributed, you know? They weren't just like some mindless drone or bot. And in Final Fantasy, like it really feels like like each job has a little flavor to it.
This is where the best gear in the game will come from, and where most of the challenging raid content lies. Savage difficulty is around N heroic to late mythic difficulty, with each boss being progressively more difficult than the last. While yes, WoW does have more mythic bosses, if you've ever been in a decently progressed mythic guild, you'll be aware of the fact that the first 5 to 7 bosses in a mythic raid are much, much easier than the last 3.
They're the warm-up fights.
There is a sharp increase in difficulty
near
the end of a mythic raid, whereas Savage is a constant progression of difficulty.
Like, if you roll into a brand new raid and you just knock over the first boss, like,
on average
you're probably going to wince a little. Like, is like this whole entire raid going to be challenging enough? Is it going to hold my attention?
This longer fight duration also exists in Extreme Trials. So when looking at encounter time,
I remember when they re-released an axe.
FF might actually have more encounter time than WoW,
like they made it way too easy. Like they wanted it to be easy, but they made it too easy.
Having trash between its
and
bosses,
it got a bad name for it.
Doesn't, but boss fight time
it was like
can
the
be
free
higher
gear
in
farm
FF14
raid.
depending on what you're looking at. This is another big reason as to why a hardcore raider can enjoy FF14, as despite a lower boss count, the bosses feel fuller and more complete, with many different phases and mechanics throughout the entire
Each one seems to have a lot more of a,
moving on to
a complete
ultimate raids,
package
it gets even
of abilities.
crazier. Ultimate raids
It's
are,
not like
without a
3 or
doubt,
4
the
kind of like
hardest pieces of raiding
randomly
content
strewn
ever
together
conceived in
abilities.
an
It's like
MMO,
a
aside
dozen
from
well thought
one-shots
out
and just cheese
combinations.
bosses. I'm sure many, many, many long-term WoW players will scream about how wrong I am for saying that, with Nax Rammus being the hardest raid ever, or Sartharian 3 Drakes, or Mythic Gul'dan, Mythic Sargeras. How can an 8-man raid be harder than a 20-man raid? Listen, I've been there. I know how hard WoW fights can be. I know that the clear rates for end Mythic bosses are extremely low. But what I can tell you is that Mythic Unat is the only fight in WoW to ever compete with ultimate raids in FF14 in terms of difficulty. And that raid was the least cleared Mythic raid in history. 8-man raids are so much harder than 20-man raids.
You didn't name very many there.
8 players, you can give those players extreme personal responsibility on a level you just cannot.
Guys, I feel lied to. I probably would have tried 14 years ago if I didn't like get this weird false narrative about it. I kept thinking that its raid encounters weren't that much of a challenge, that it was like, yeah, it's a challenge, but it's a challenge within the context of playing Final Fantasy XIV. I didn't think like it really held up compared to a lot of MMO players. But now all of a sudden I'm seeing like high-end raiders from WoW like react to some of the fights and like give their, you know, their own experiences and their own like testimonies, like, oh yeah, there's like definitely like a good experience to be had here. I tried it back in Stormblood. It was like midway through. And that was back when ARR was still a bit more of a slog. It wasn't trimmed down just yet. And still has a little bit of a pacing issue right now, but it's vastly improved. I could tell. I could definitely tell the difference. But, oh man, what my life would have been like had I just not done Shadowlands and just, like, continued from there.
Not do with 20 people. 20 points of failure versus 8 points of failure. With a smaller amount of failure points,
I'll never have to get second-guess
harder
myself.
Individual challenges. Add on the fact that ultimate raids can last up to 20 minutes with one mistake having the ability to cause a wipe and reset your progress back to the beginning, and oh man, are these fights insanely difficult. You can point out clear dates and how many people clear ultimates and say that they're easier than certain WoW bosses, but that's only because WoW bosses are gear gated.
I don't think there's anything even like that in WoW. Well, except for like 1 or 2 raids that are designed that way,
players
but
being best in slot.
like a mode that way is awesome.
Tailor-made to be incredibly difficult, and you cannot overgear them. Even when a new raid releases, ultimate raids are item level synced, meaning if you come in with better gear later on, too bad, your stats get lowered to the level they were when the raid was released. 4 years after the first ultimate was released, we still have thousands of players attempting them, and progressing for months, hoping to get a clear. This is where high-end, hardcore raiders live in Final Fantasy XIV. Ultimate raids have basically ruined other MMOs for me. Without the insane challenges of Ultimate, I just don't know how to have fun in an MMO anymore. I crave that insane challenge, the hours of wiping 15 minutes in and banging your head in frustration, and the immense satisfaction of finally overcoming the challenge and clearing an Ultimate.
I was talking to a friend. We were out having a little like campfire over the weekend, and he brought up New World because a coworker was talking about it. Like, I guess he's got a coworker who's super hype for New World, and I would definitely use the word hype. I'm sure it's going to be like a really good game. I heard it was originally appealing to PvP players, but it was kind of toned down or like normalized a bit more, you know, as it predictably would happen. But yeah, the coworker was like really hyped for New World, and he was like asking if we'd ever heard anything about it, and I was like yeah, it's probably going to last a month. You know, it's probably going to be another. It's going to be another one of those like, what is it, like Elder Scrolls Online or Destiny, or like a lot of like there's a lot of MMOs, KOTOR. A lot of MMOs where like people are just like, this is the one and only, like no other game is ever going to like accomplish the heights that this will accomplish, and then that just peters off immediately because they didn't work on the end game. Whoops, forgot about that. And it's usually like a really good game, but it's just like half-baked. So we'll see for New World, but that's like another awesome appeal with Final Fantasy XIV for me is I don't know if I would have liked it as much if I originally started playing it back in ARR or even Heavensward, because Heavensward, a lot of people were touting that and saying like, oh, Heavensward, oh, that's where it really gets good. And it does, it absolutely does, but I think it was like halfway through Heavensward where it started appealing to me more. And it could just be, you know, my own personal taste, but yeah, it picked up heavy, but it also still had a bit of that ARR feel in it too.
I have dozens of clears on these fights, and still enjoy doing them to this day.
Fingers crossed for
Some
New
people
World,
have
best of
hundreds
luck.
of clears of ultimates, no longer needing the transmog rewards, but just doing them because the challenge is so fun.
Oh,
Even
wow.
after your 20th clear,
See, that's
there is
like
still a joy
a real
to be had in
compliment.
the amount of skill it requires to be cleared. When I say
Like,
I
you got
enjoy
a team of
FF14,
guildies or
that's
just like a
mostly because
random
I love ultimate raids.
a
Moving on
random
from Ultimates,
scrub
a
who's
huge
like,
reason I stick with FF14
I need help,
over
I want to
WoW
run
as
this
a
raid, will you
competitive
join? And
hardcore
he's like,
raider
oh heck
is the
yeah, just because I want to
simplicity
experience
of
the
gearing
fight
in
again.
FF14. I cannot tell you how
The fight's
liberating
that
it felt
good.
to leave World of Warcraft and come over to FF14 and find out that there are actual best-in-slot lists that give me an extremely clear...
And I felt like that about a lot of WoW fights. Like, there are those people in WoW where as soon as you complete your best in slot list, speaking of best in slot, soon as you complete your best in slot list, like, they would just be like, oh, peace out, guys. Like, I have schoolwork, I have work conflicts suddenly cropping up, you know? But really, it's like they just wanted to complete their best in slot, and then they are like done rating for that tier. And people started, you know, picking up on those trends too. Like, you can't get away with that forever. Luckily, I never had experienced anything like that myself, but I heard stories. But yeah, quick tangent, like, I miss that so much about WoW as well. Like, that's exactly what I love about 14 is once I saw, like, there's a recommended gear button. Why would you need something like that? It's apparently not very complex. But that was what I loved about WoW, is being able to look at a piece of gear and be like, oh, well, roughly crit's worth this much, strength and hit is worth this much for me. You know, like, it changes. The more of one stat often throws off the weight of another, but it's like a ballpark. You know what you're looking for. And I love that Final Fantasy has like that same sort of best in slot. Like, they don't try and make it so that you have to go to an outside source or like make it needlessly difficult, you know, needlessly complex to put up the veneer of like sophistication, you know, when really it's like you're muddying the waters. Like, the game, you're just making the game run more poorly. Like, just make it straightforward and give people some agency. Best in slot lists are so key to
I hated the RNG factor of gearing in WoW. With
being
some
able to
pieces
tune
coming
in
from
like
Mythic Plus,
this is my
meaning I would have
track.
to wait for my weekly vault and hope I get the highest item
These
level
are my
version,
goals, and I'm going to
and other
work towards
pieces
them.
coming from raiding, but maybe they don't ever drop, or they go to other players, and I'm seemingly just pulling a slot machine hoping to get an upgrade. In stark comparison,
Yeah, someone gets their best in slot week 1, you're there like halfway through month 2.
Being Savage
Like,
Raids
hope I
and
get
your
my
weekly
roll.
tomestones. These weekly
I just
tomestones
want
are
my
most akin
bracers,
to Valor Points
please.
in WoW. They are rewarded to you for completing max level content, with a weekly cap of 450, and gear items ranging from 375 tomestones to 1,000.
Nice.
Only
So you
having
know,
two
like, there's a
sources of
set
max
cap
item
and you're
level
working
gear
towards it.
means that you can create clear best-in-slot gear sets and have the exact path to get them laid out in front of you. This is because Savage Raids are not purely gear drop based. Savage Raids drop treasure chests that contain a certain piece of gear, and you can open this chest on any class.
Yeah, that's how it should be. Like,
piece for that specific class.
so
For
if
example,
it drops
the
from
final
the
boss
raid,
of a Savage Raid
bonus,
tier drops
money,
a weapon chest.
but if
And
it
you
doesn't,
get the weapon chest,
you know, you're
it's
still
not
on your
a
way.
sword, or an axe, or a bow. It's whatever you want it to be. And you
Perfect.
determine what weapon you'll get from it by opening it on the class that uses a...
that's another huge thing. Like, because in WoW, like, they bank on you having alts, so they design the gear drop pool around that idea in mind. But in Final Fantasy, like, they're already concerned with bag space. They already assume someone's going to play literally every single job in the entire game, so they have to make the bag space account for that. So things like shared gear sets are already worked into the game's baseline design. Things like having a weapon token drop and you could just choose whatever weapon you want is worked into the game's baseline design principles. That is so badass.
The particular weapon type. Even better is that clearing a savage raid fight gives
I feel
you a
like I'm
currency
home.
once per week, specific to every single boss.
I feel like I'm finally
and after acquiring
home.
enough of these boss-specific currencies, you can trade them for items that boss will drop. So after a certain amount of weeks, you are guaranteed to receive the item you're looking for.
Yay!
This means that you can accurately predict when you will get your best-in-slot items, how long it will take to upgrade them to max item level, and what specific pieces you're searching for. Lastly, a great benefit to a player like me who enjoys all types of games and not just FF14 is that logging out for days at a time doesn't mean that you fall behind. In World of Warcraft, when you are in a high-end Mythic raiding guild...
What? But how are you going to retain player retention if you don't have a infinite loop system? A forever grind that has diminishing returns, but you need to do it daily also to optimize the maximum benefit.
It can feel like you have to grind out
I'm just
whatever
not understanding this,
expansion
guys.
currency is required
Not
to power up
understanding
your
this
borrowed
game.
power system. I remember doing hundreds of mob souls runs in Legion to farm artifact power, grinding out islands in BFA for Azurite, and now in Shadowlands, Torghast and Maw dailies. I hated feeling forced to play the game to farm some arbitrary currency for a system that will be invalidated in a patch.
You didn't like artifact power AP or Azurite power AP or anima power AP?
In FF14, the only things you have to care about on a weekly basis is your weekly raid lockout and tomestones.
Yes.
Tomestones, like I mentioned before, come from literally any piece of level 80 content. So you can do whatever you enjoy in the game and
You
get
just
rewarded.
level your job.
I don't have to do a specific
level your
activity
gear
that's
set,
super boring for some random
and
currency
then you
that I
just
don't
do
care
the
about.
raids each week.
I can just do one dungeon per day and cap my tomestones over time.
Win.
And guess what? When I have the tomestone gear I want for my main class, I can just stop capping my tomestones every week. The game allows you to choose what you want to do, how often you want to do it, and doesn't lock you into a system that requires upkeep, otherwise you fall behind. There have been times where I've logged out for weeks at a time while my raid team was taking a short break, and when I logged back in weeks later,
I've definitely
I was
been
the
playing
same
that
power
way.
level I left off
In
at,
WoW,
and
like,
on par with everyone else.
It started
In
getting to the
high-end
point where
raid
I wouldn't
community,
log into
it
WoW
generally
for like
takes
2 to
8
3 weeks
of raiding to get full best in
because
slot.
I needed to log
So
in
after
every
8
day.
weeks of
And so just
reclears,
like
you have
that sort of, well, screw you. You know, kind of. It's just that, I mean, it's angsty. It's an angsty sort of mood, but it's that sort of like, oh, I have to do that. I have to do my chores. Like, I didn't want to log in and like have to do things. And I just wanted to log in and get to do things, you know? But like, I always had to do things, so I never did. And so even though I was supposed to be doing things like daily in WoW, I would probably be playing like a couple times out of the month. But here in Final Fantasy, I could just take a couple days off. And
have months to do whatever you
I don't
want.
feel like I just shot
Raid
myself
on
in the
alt
foot or
class
anything.
because in FF you can have every class on the same character, farm mounts in
I don't know,
extreme
like,
trials,
Endgame
tack on
continues
ultimate
that
and continue
mindset,
your raid
continues,
journey,
like, that raid
or
mentality.
log out until the next raid
Beautiful.
releases. World of Warcraft always felt like it was
Money
designed
bounce
for
there,
people
almost
who
died.
only play
Buzzy
WoW.
bounce.
And while I love FF14 and have over 10,000 hours
It's like a
played,
0.1%
I still play
health
other
there.
games every single day, and do not want to play FF all day every day. In
Yeah.
closing, when I was moving away from WoW and drifting
Variety
towards
is the spice
FF14,
of
I was
life.
very skeptical if it could hold
You
the
need some
attention of a more
novelty to
hardcore
keep
raider like
things fresh.
myself. However, I 100%
brain
made the right
engaged.
decision moving over to 14, with Ultimate Raiding breathing
Novelty
new
is
life
key.
into the MMO genre for me. It gave me a goal to strive for, and required me to get better as a player, think deeper about the game, and push myself to be the best player I possibly could be. As long as FF14 keeps releasing ultimates, I'll keep playing. If you love challenging yourself and overcoming difficult bosses, then FF14 is 100%
It seems like they got
the
no
game
shortage
for you.
of
Despite
creativity
being
for
focused on
their
more
bosses
casual
as well.
content, there is still plenty of content for high-end raiders and people who enjoy
Every
being
once in a
really
while,
good
I
at the games they
accidentally
play.
see like
The speedrun community in 14
one of the later
is
expansion
huge,
bosses
and
for like a
competition is
couple minutes
fierce.
here and there, like
There's
on
also
some
a
video,
huge parsing community,
and I'll just be like
fighting
jaw
for high
drop. Like,
percentiles is really
how do
fun.
they make
It can definitely get a bit repetitive when you're trying
ideas
to be the
like
best in the
these
world, but
come to
what
fruition?
game isn't like that? If
How
you're
do they
still on the
have
fence
such
about trying
thoughts
FF14,
bubbling up in their
then
minds?
I'd say give it a try. It starts really slow,
So
and most
imaginative.
people will try to tell you about how good the music is, or the story, or the glamour system, but for the gamers out there, unshowered, smelly, and sweaty raid gods, you have a home in 14. If you liked this video, leave a like.
Maximum
if you didn't,
sweat.
a dislike. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with my videos, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
Hello,
Peace.
sweaties. That was great.